Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington, Chapter 5, The Road Well Traveled, Part 3. Stories including Headlong into Forever, Train to Nowhere, and Sisters in Spirit. We find our first story, again, Headlong into Forever. Collecting ghost stories has in one way been a bit like experience of parenting. The more personal involvement I've had, the less sure I have been that I understand and understood any of the theories inherent in the practice. For example, if a ghost is what's left behind after a human life has ended, then how do you account for sightings of ships that sank hundreds of years ago? One comfortable explanation of that phenomenon might be that such apparitions are merely spectral images, mirages concocted from a combination of sea spray and overactive imaginations. But I wish to extend an invitation to ponder a similar but even more puzzling manifestation, that of phantom trains. Ghost trains have been seen by many reliable and experienced trainmen. The following one is such a tale. In 1890, an engineer with the Northern Pacific Railroad was driving locomotive number 33 through a particularly dangerous stretch of track in the Cascade Mountains. We can never know exactly what happened as he piloted his train toward Eagle Gorge. We only know that the train derailed and plummeted to the gorge floor below, killing everyone on board. From that day forward, all the train engineers who followed in Cypher's path redoubled their vigilance in that area, especially at night. They were all too aware that the stretch had already taken a colleague's life, and that the least little mistake could result in the gorge, taking their lives as well. Even more troubling, as though, was the terrifying image that many experienced trainmen saw as they approached that fateful spot on the single track line. Another train heading straight toward theirs at top speed. Just as the two trains seemed about to collide, the ghostly locomotive would vanish into thin air. History tells us that this phantom train continued to run on the tracks between the Hanson Dam and the town of Leicester until at least 1892, because it was then that the Seattle area newspapers carried a full report of phenomenon as told to them by the engineer, J.M. Pinckney. To Pinckney's utter terror, the phantom locomotive had charged right at his own. It was not until Pinckney noticed that the lights on the front of the locomotive that was bearing down on him were multicolored, and he realized he was seeing a ghost. You see, in those days, train headlights were illuminated by kerosene, which casts only dull brown glow. It would seem that Tom Cypher, engineer of locomotive number 33, was not only doomed to suffer a dreadful death, but also to endure the torture of endlessly reenacting his fatal accident and striking terror into the hearts of his fellow engineers. In our second of three stories for today, Train to Nowhere. Train to Nowhere. Roughly halfway between Seattle and Tacoma lies Kent, Washington, and a more recent tale of a phantom train. On a winter's day, nearly 40 years ago, two employees of a local flower shop, a man named Thompson and an older woman whose name has been lost to history, were driving through Kent and making some deliveries. Thompson was at the wheel. As he approached the train tracks, he could hear the sounds of a locomotive. The sounds were very loud, so he assumed the train was quite close. Thompson slowed the car in anticipation of stopping at the level crossing just ahead. When he had brought the car to a halt roughly 10 feet back of the train tracks, Tom experienced the surprise of his life. He also found out why the engine noises he'd heard had been so loud. Much to his astonishment, there, just in front of his car, huffing and puffing for all it was worth, was an innocent steam engine. Thompson had not seen one of those behemoths for years, and then only in a museum. He was fascinated. In silence, the man and woman watching as first engineer, then the tender, and finally a string of passenger cars rolled past their waiting automobile. As each section of the train passed, Thompson was more and more amazed. This magnificent iron horse had to be a very special train on its way to a very special event. Not only was the train itself unusual, but it was easy to see the people inside were all dressed in old-fashioned costumes. In his excitement, Thomas did something he hadn't done. He waved to the folks on board. Much to his disappointment, even though he could see that each one of the passengers was staring directly at him, none of them returned his greeting. By the time the tracks in front of his car were once again clear, Thompson found that his initial excitement had been replaced by an inexplicable feeling of having been chilled to the bone. When the noise and dust created by the strange train had receded, he turned and stared at his companion, assuming that she would look as confused as he felt. Much to the surprise, the older woman was merely nodding knowingly. Clearly and calmly as she possibly could, Thompson's co-worker explained that they had just witnessed the legendary ghost train. Some said the powerful steam engine pulled cars full of criminals. Others merely acknowledged that the startling apparition was a phantom locomotive, for nothing like it had existed on this side of the veil for a very long time, for sure. Hopefully you enjoyed that second story. And our third and closing story for today, Sisters in Spirit. Sisters in Spirit. You can be sure that the majority of Spokane citizens in the late 1800s and early 1900s were not prim and proper sissies. For one folks with a preference for the easy life never have ventured away from their comfortable parlors in the East. And if by some chance a person with a delicate nature had chosen to set out for the wild and woolly West, the rigors of the trip would most likely have eradicated the last vestiges of their fastidiousness long before they reached Spokane. As a result, most of the residents in the eastern Washington city's early days were pretty hard characters. Unnerving them was not an easy task. It is ironic, then, that the sight of the two haggard-looking women dancing a silent duet on a stage in an opera house just outside Spokane drove a grizzled old caretaker screaming into the night. Once you've heard the story, you'll have no doubt that you will understand his reaction. Bella Rawhide and Timber Tate were working girls in the most corporal sense of the phrase. They did a sort of song and dance show in many of the bars and saloons that dotted the West in the 1880s. But it was not for the performing arts that they were best known or most appreciated. The woman made a decidedly odd pair. Timber Tate must have been an arresting sight. She was a redhead who dressed in bright, shiny clothes. She was also, in a word, huge. She stood over 6 feet tall and was as strong as an ox. Furthermore, Kate didn't have a shy bone in her body. Some would have gone so far as to call her brazen, although never to her face. Timber Tate was, after all, widely known for her knockout punches. Bella Rawhide was a blue-eyed blonde of average height, where Timber Tate was both shrewd and quick to anger. Bella had a pleasant disposition and was, right to the end of her life, pushover for a sad story. The odd pair usually billed themselves as sisters. In her last years, Bella maintained that Kate was really her mother, but poor Bella Rawhide rarely drew a sober breath during that period, so it's probably unwise to put much stock in that allegation. The absolute truth about their biological relationship may never be known, but it seems likely that the women really hoped the sibling designation would draw more paying customers. Although their differences were many, Bella and Kate were inseparable for a great number of years. Together, they worked their way through the dance halls from Nevada to Washington and back. And they had their sister routine down to a science. Timber Kate would travel to the next town and post notices about their upcoming performance. Bella would stay behind for a few days so she could tend to their outlandish dance hall costumes and tidy up whatever loose ends might remain. Upon reuniting, the women would do their show, seduce their customers, and then begin the whole cycle over again. The strange pair had worked in this pattern for many years and probably would have continued to do so for quite some time if they had not fallen in love with the same man. Tug Daniels was the object of their affections, and they could scarcely have made the worse choice. Daniels was a con man who had no interest in either of the women beyond relieving them of their rather substantial earnings, that is. Daniels decided to beguile Bella Rawhide first. The unsuspecting woman fell for his questionable charms, hook, line, and sinker. When Timber Kate saw what was happening, she was furious, and for the first and last time in her life landed one of her famous haymaker punches against the side of Bella's head. When she regained consciousness, Bella was terrified of Kate and deeply worried about what form of other woman's jealous rage might take place. The badly bruised Bella fled, with Tug Daniels in tow. The pair had traveled all the way to Carson City, Nevada, before they felt it was safe to stop. Tug apparently wasn't one to earn a living, so the ever-resourcing Bella openly bought a house and plied her well-honed and most remarkable skills instead. Tug stayed with her for a while, perhaps acting as a forerunner of today's house husband. Soon, however, the lure of adventure called to him, and Tug took off for parts unknown, taking Bella's savings with him. Not knowing what else to do, Bella Rawhide continued to operate her popular house of ill repute. Timber Kate had not fared as well. She had drifted throughout the West, trying, without success, various approaches to making a living with her talents, until one night she found herself in Carson City, and on the doorstep of Bella's bordello. Once reunited, the duo immediately set about rekindling their volatile relationship over copious quantities of moonshine. It's not known whether Kate or Bella ever really tried to iron out their grudges. What is known, however, is that over the next several months, as they rarely spoke a civil word to one another, just when the women's positive relationship had deteriorated about as badly as it could have, Tug Daniels arrived back on the scene and managed to make the situation even worse. Before long, a physical fight broke out. That match must have been something to see, given that the years had not been kind to any of the combatants. When Timber Kate lunged at Tug, the haymaker punch, from which she had once been famous, succeeded only in forcing her off balance. She fell against the knife Tug Daniels and succeeded in forcing her off balance. She fell against the knife Tug Daniels had extended in her direction, fatally ripping open her abdomen. Daniels fled, leaving the enormous woman to the indignity of bleeding to death on a whorehouse floor. Bella was never the same of her former partner. She took to drinking heavily and indiscriminately. Just a few months later, the smaller of the two sisters also died in the house. Her death had been caused by indigestion of a lethal dose of cleaning fluid. And that should have been the end of the tale about these two unusual pioneer women. But Timber Kate and Bella Rawhide's stories don't end with their deaths. The caretaker who was cleaning the Spokane area dance hall all those years later recognized the specters prancing around across the stage in the darkened dance hall. They were the ghosts of Timber Kate and Bella Rawhide. Others reported seeing the image of a bedraggled-looking woman meeting the description of Bella, stumbling and crawling through the roadside gutters, clutching at her mouth and throat, trying vainly to extinguish the excruciating, painful burning that would have resulted from drinking a poisonous liquid. And unsettling as that phantom image would have been, there was a tobacconist who would, no doubt, have far preferred Bella's ghost to the vision he witnessed. That unfortunate man was a shopkeeper whose name has been lost to history, and he actually suffered physical harm when he was targeted by the wrath of Timber Kate's wraith. Late one evening, the man was locking up his shop and preparing to head home when a person moved around the side of the building caught his attention. At first, because of the dusk and shadows, he might have thought it was a man dressed in women's clothing, but a moment later he must have realized that the peculiar-looking stranger was in fact a very large woman. Wondering what on earth the woman was doing, he approached her. As he did, the figure mysteriously vanished, leaving only a poster flapping in the evening breeze on the outside wall of his store. Annoyed at having an advertisement defacing his store, the tobacconist took hold of the paper at the corner, began to rip it off. His tiding was cut short, however, by the powerful sucker punch to the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground unconscious. Hours later, the poor shopkeeper was found where he had dropped, lying beneath a poster informing the public that the musical sister act of Bella Rawhide and Timber Kate would soon be arriving in town. Now that you know the background to the incident, it is certainly easy to see why that caretaker at the dance hall near Spokane fled screaming into the night. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Ghost Stories of Washington, Chapter 5, The Road Well Traveled, Part 3, Headlong into Forever, Train to Nowhere, and Sisters in Spirit. Until our next episode, have a great day, and we will see you soon in more Ghost Stories of Washington State. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye now.